Okay, hi everybody. I'm just going to get my presentation up and running, and then we'll get started. So my name is Dr. Fiona Vera-Gray. I'm talking from the London Metropolitan University, just forgot my institution, the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit. This is about a project called Rupture and Repair, which was funded through the Violence and Mental Health Network Understanding theme. The background to the study was thinking about the tension that's in academic research, but also within practice, and practitioners, about the dominance of trauma as a way of understanding the harms, initially of sexual violence, but as the project progressed, started looking at violence against women more broadly. Instead, what I wanted to do was think about what happens if we bring an existential phenomenological approach, which looks at being in the world in terms of being with others, being in time, and being embodied. What does that do to our understanding of how violence against women and girls harms and the ways that we think about trauma? So these were the project's aims. I'm not going to read them aloud, as you can read them yourself, but just to really make the point that this wasn't about discarding or getting rid of trauma and replacing it with another idea or ideology that then becomes dominant. This was about what happens if we start to think about things in a slightly different way. What does it bring into focus, and what does it push into the background? Had kind of three main research questions, which were very much working with this idea of survivor practitioner, which was about bringing together a group of women who all had lived experience of some form of violence against women and girls, be it sexual harassment, coercive control, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, rape, to work together as a form of co-reflexive research, where analysis became this iterative process, real collaboration, where we work together to think about the themes of the workshop, and to come together to analyze what was coming out of what we were saying. So there was 5 of us. In the end, we're quite a diverse group, even for 5. We had a range of age differences, range of race, ethnicities, and classes, all heterosexual. So sexuality is really something that's lacking in our group. The workshops in the end started off as 3, turned into 4, ended up as 5 themed workshops looking around trauma, relationships, time, space, and bodies. We each gave each other readings of things that we thought would be interesting, and then had time to discuss, and then came together to analyze these together. Like a lot of research, there was a lot of disruptions and detours, delays, the pandemic. 3 of our members actually fell very ill. I moved institutions from Durham to London Met, and also I underestimated the time taken for co-analysis and true co-production. But what I'm going to do now is present to you very emerging findings. The last workshop was only had last week, and so we're really in the process of still analysing. The aim is to come out with a book, but also to produce a short animation that can be shared amongst practitioners and also victim survivors, so we can all start seeing a little bit more easily than reading a book what's come out of the project. The first and probably unsurprising thing is we were quite critical of the idea of trauma, that it's come to mean everything. So in a way, it's come to mean nothing. Everything becomes trauma. But also we talked very much about how for some forms of trauma, trauma is very legitimizing, particularly thinking about racial and race, the trauma of racialization. Also thinking about racialization, this idea of others, and Susan Bryson, for example, has written about the role of others in remaking the self. We've complicated that a little bit, thinking about what does that mean when you're involved in a social process where you have been othered. Time became huge. It's very much, I think, one of our core findings, is that if we are beings in time, this is what has fundamentally changed by violence against women, that you're in time, but you're out of time. You're no longer inhabiting time, but in a way you're carrying time, carrying the past with you. So space, we thought very much around this idea of feeling haunted as a metaphor of understanding that idea of carrying the past with you. A duppy, which is used very much in the Caribbean as a way of talking about being haunted or carrying the spectres of the past along into your present. And that some of that way we carry that up is through our bodies, that Western traditions have very much taught us to locate the psychological wound of trauma in our minds. But actually, when we start thinking outside of the Western tradition, we see long histories of thinking about mental health in terms of bodies, not somatization, but actual wounds in the body. Which brings me back to the idea that I'd started with, which was this idea of rupture. Actually, we've gotten to a place where we complicate the idea of rupture. I don't think that that's entirely right. It implies that there's a whole that can be restored, and that's not what we're thinking at the moment. It's about this idea of what could have never been, always becoming, never become. So instead, we're looking at this concept of ruins, not ruined, but ruins, as in a manifestation in the present that sits as testimony to what was. Ruins are valued for their history, for their story. We don't seek to restore them, but we do return to them. And so that means, again, that we complicate this idea of repair, that maybe it isn't about rupture and repair. Actually, there is no repair. But it's about this idea of return, and that no repair doesn't need to be a negative thing. It just needs to be acknowledged and accepted for what it is. And in some ways that shows the harms of violence. So we've ended up at the moment at this place of return. Sankofa is a symbol and a mythology used in Ghanaian culture, which talks about going back and getting it. You see here the bird that's looking backwards. And this is where we're thinking, that there is something here about the need to go back and get it. And that's something that's actually can be discouraged in the ways that trauma and the trauma industry works, in terms of you're allowed a 50-minute session once a week to go back and get it, and then you have to carry on. But we're thinking that our findings are going to mean that something different might be needed as a model of support. And that's where we're going to go from this point on. Thank you very much.